Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Anna Brady, a third-year law student at the University of Oregon. Brady's interests are writing, environmental literature and leadership, and arts-based advocacy. She earned a master's degree in the environmental humanities at the University of Utah in 2015 under the tutelage of Terry Tempest Williams. In addition to her law studies, Brady serves as a policy and communication strategist for Utah Diné Bikéyah, a nonprofit organization. Brady will be a panelist at the Environmental Justice, Race, and Public Land Symposium held at U of O May 9th through 11th, 2018. Thanks, Anna, for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
So you have this master's degree in the environmental humanities from the University of Utah. How do you define the environmental humanities?
Sure. Well, it's, I think, an emerging interdisciplinary field that really investigates and explores the intersections between our species and the kinds of humanities and art forms that we engage with as that relates to our relationship to the natural world. So recognizing that, excuse me, anytime we write or paint or study humanity or the natural world, we're necessarily engaging that relationship that sustains all of us, that our art forms, our literatures, our ways of knowing are necessarily predicated on the beyond human. And environmental humanities as a discipline, or as a field, a space where disciplines can join and converse, to my mind, is an area where we can bring the sciences into dialogue with the arts, where we can bring different ways of knowing into conversation with one another in order to more fully understand what our relationship is at this critical historical moment that we inhabit. And I think that though the term environmental humanities has been more recently coined as a discipline, I think it's something that's been engaged for a long, long time, going back in many different types of wisdom traditions and arts and literatures as in a way the very nugget of our study about who we are as a species on Earth. And I think art has a unique way of helping inform that study. It's very complementary to science. It deepens and expands and allows us space to acknowledge that all that we are and all that the greater world is cannot be summed up purely by objective observation, but has to be felt and interpreted, and humanities really help serve that deeper understanding.
So what's your path to that degree? Why did you decide you wanted to get a master's degree in environmental humanities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for a long, long time I've been very curious about the nature, if you will, of the relationship between our species and everything that encompasses us. If you call it nature, if we call it the natural world, the beyond human. And that had been kind of a driving inquiry for me in my undergraduate studies as well, which I did at the University of Montana in English and environmental studies. So this query has been one that's been with me for a long time, and explored that both through writing of my own and through the study of literatures, both domestic, international, of many different disciplines and ethnicities, and certainly Native American literature was, I found, profoundly informative of that, particularly because much of the canon, if you will, of nature and environmental literature has been predominated by a lot of white male voices, and that has offered some valuable insights, but it certainly doesn't encapsulate all the different ways of perceiving and receiving and interplay that goes along with that. So when it felt like it came time for me to pursue higher education and further degree, I was really drawn to the program at Utah, in particular because of the opportunity to work with Terry Tempest Williams, who's been a hero of mine since I first encountered her work as a teenager. And we only have so many chances in life to work with our heroes, and when the door opened for me to do that, and then to be able to teach writing at the same time at the University of Utah in a kind of a reciprocal way that wouldn't break the bank for me to do higher ed, it felt like, how could I say no?
Okay, so now you're at the University of Oregon and you're pursuing a law degree.
Right.
What inspired you to take that path?
Yeah, excellent question. What inspires a person to undertake law school? I still ask myself that sometimes, every day. No, I think it had been something that was percolating for me for a while. I think the one limitation I found in writing or in studying literatures, which I love, I think there's the piece of me that will always be, the poet, the writer that sees the world in metaphor in that way. But I really wanted to feel like I could take that and elevate it into the language of power in a lot of ways, and be able to participate in those kinds of conversations, to be able to bring the narratives that people share when they want to advocate for the places that they love, and bring those all the way to the top, and not feel that that ceiling over one's head of, well, I can take you so far, but beyond here, we have to put you in the hands of the law. But to be able to carry that all the way through, and law really, in a lot of ways, at this point in time in our history and in our culture, I think is the language of power, and I craved that literacy. There have been interesting insights along the way about what that truly entails. But I think, for many of us who feel compelled by the arts and humanities, who feel an affinity with the natural world and understand the kinds of challenges that we face at this moment, the world of the law can be not necessarily our natural habitat, if you will. It's a place of a lot of structure and rules and formality and posturing, and yet I felt maybe that I could kind of tuck inside that Trojan horse and figure out the way its gears worked, and start working on the nuts and bolts that way.
So what kind of law are you going to specialize in, do you know?
Yeah, so my focus to this point has been, and what I hope to do moving forward, is at the intersection of natural resource law and federal Indian law. And ideally beyond simply the scope of federal Indian law, which is how we conceptualize of the legal framework in involving sovereign tribal nations within this country, but also working with indigenous groups more broadly. So certainly the environmental piece has been something that's been with me for a long time, and the deeper I dove into that, the more I kept finding that anytime we talk about natural resources or the environment, we ought to be engaging with those communities, those individuals, those wisdom traditions that have inhabited this continent since time immemorial. The law does recognize tribes as sovereigns within the United States, which is a very unique legal status to occupy. And from that point, tribes have potentially, and I think increasingly, are exercising a tremendous amount of power, as well as moral authority. And I think that the two combined, the legal apparatus and status that's accorded to tribes, along with that depth of relationship that indigenous communities, Native peoples have with their ancestral territories, which is something I've learned more and more about through my work. There's tremendous potency there, and it's not potency that's to be used or co-opted, or it's always helping. In my mind, the work is to help support and elevate the tribal voices into the visions of the future for their own peoples and the lands and resources that they care most deeply about. Help elevate that into the more dominant conversation, and along the way, I think there's the opportunity to really help shift the paradigm. if we see it that way. So my hope is to continue working with tribes and particularly helping sort of translate between the environmental organization and the sovereign tribal nations, because those avenues of communication have evolved and transitioned over time.
So let's talk a little bit about the work that you do with tribes. So first, tell us about the work of Utah Diné Bikéyah. What does that group do? Who are they and what do they do?
Absolutely. So Utah Diné Bikéyah, or UDB, as I might fall into referring to it, is a Native American-led nonprofit organization led with a board of directors, all grassroots Native American elders, based in Utah, in Salt Lake, and then down in the very southeast corner of Utah. And the organization was started in 2010 by a core group of board members who still operate today, most of whom are, well, all of whom are Navajo and Ute Mountain Ute traditional tribal elders and community leaders, and came together to respond to some challenging social justice and environmental protection issues that these individuals and their communities were really concerned about. Very briefly, in 2009, the FBI conducted the largest sting operation of looted archaeological objects in American history, and that was down in rural southeast Utah in what is now recognized as the Bears Ears Cultural Landscape and the Bears Ears National Monument. And this event, this realizing that non-Native neighbors had been pillaging sacred sites that are very, very deeply considered the resting places, but also the dwelling places of the ancestors, that struck a profound chord with Native communities in that area. Incidentally, that area of the world, that area of Utah, has also had dealt with some interesting social justice challenges in terms of voting rights and public education support and reform. So there have been any number of efforts through the years, always grassroots up, to bring a greater degree of equity to that area. Some people refer to it as the deep south of the West. And so Utah Diné Bikéyah was formed in order to respond to that circumstance, and not only respond to what sometimes that can be construed negatively. It wasn't a reaction. It was a really depthful response out of the concept of healing. And that's always been really at the core of the work that UDB does. The mission talks about the idea of healing people and the earth. And so Utah Diné Bikéyah grew and developed and became very involved in the public lands planning effort that was happening in that area, initially under Senator Bob Bennett, and then when Bennett was replaced under Representative Bob Bennett and then Representative Bishop. Political processes to try and sort out not just what was happening with public lands in San Juan County, which occupies the southeast corner of Utah, but all 7 counties along the eastern edge. And so the individuals, folks like Willie Gray Eyes and Mark Maryboy and Jonah Yellowman, these are folks who still operate on the board, really kept just steadily one foot in front of the other, educating, helping to bring the information to the Native communities, which that information wasn't always being relayed, and often wasn't being relayed in the languages of those communities, especially that those elders still speak and may only be Navajo speakers in many areas. So participating in the public processes, and over time, that seeing that the processes that were being facilitated by Republican elected state leaders weren't necessarily according the kind of enfranchisement that Native community leaders hoped for and really were going to demand, they began to create their own initiative and their own effort within that process, and that grew into the Bears Ears National Monument Initiative campaign. which was really gestated by Utah Diné Bikéyah and then lifted and shared and ultimately taken up by the 5 sovereign tribal nations of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, which we'll probably talk more about. So Utah Diné Bikéyah continues to do a tremendous amount of work and has grown by leaps and bounds, even in the time since I've been involved as a staff person. I started in June of 2015, so I've been in that role concurrent to law school, which has been a ride. And so UDB continues to support the tribes in their sovereign efforts to defend Bears Ears National Monument and that cultural landscape, and also always working with the grassroots communities to continue to build capacity, build power, build voice for those individuals and for those communities that haven't always been listened to the degree that they should by the county, the state, and the federal government.
So tell me about that tribal coalition. What are the tribes that are part of that coalition?
Yeah, so there's 5 tribes in the coalition. The Navajo Nation, the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, the Zuni, Pueblo of Zuni, Northern Ute, or the Uinta-Ure Ute, and the Hopi Tribe. And what's remarkable about that is that tribes are by no means monolithic. Sometimes when folks look from the outside, we talk about Native Americans or Indians or Indian country, and that's a thing. But tribes each, of course, have their own unique cultural traditions, beliefs. Even the patterns, the way prayers are said, is different from tribe to tribe, of course. And several of the tribes within that coalition have had historical friction or animosity, but this vision of protecting the Bears Ears cultural landscape, which is sacred and tremendously significant to all of those 5 tribes for various and different reasons. That vision of protecting that and of tribes collaboratively managing the first sacred public lands area in United States history was a unifying vision that really brought tribes together from that region in a remarkable and historic way. To see Navajo Nation and Hopi working side by side as co-chairs of this coalition, it would be like OSU and UO, sitting side by side planning their game plays, something equivalently significant and of tremendous import. So the tribes have been hugely effective in their initiative. For something of this scale, it moved remarkably quickly and really resonated with at the federal level in DC. So the tribes are continuing to work together. The coalition is still very much an entity, and I think that it's been a powerful force for the tribes to see what gets done when we work together in that way. And again, always around that idea of healing. Mm-hmm. Centrally, it's not about mine, it's not about yours or who it belongs to precisely, but that we can come together and that this place that's been recognized as a sacred place for millennia, this can be a place where we can help to promote healing of all people and all beings.
So give us a status update on the impacts of their work, mm-hmm. the high points, the complications. Yes. Tell us what's been going on.
Sure. So it's a full story, but the kind of long and short of it is that after a remarkable initiative campaign effort through 2015 and 2016, on December 28th, 2016, President Barack Obama formally designated Bears Ears National Monument, really the first truly Native American national monument in history, which is notable because the Antiquities Act, the law that Obama invoked and utilized in order to protect that area, was initially passed in 1906 in order, as the name implies, to protect antiquities, Native American sites. And And yet, never before in its 110-year history had it been invoked by tribes themselves to protect an area considered sacred from the tribal perspective. It had always been kind of that, coming from the federal government and dictating this is an important area or this is an important area. So it was a remarkable achievement for Indian country, broadly speaking. And of course, December 28th, 2016 came after the 2016 election, presidential election. So there was already an awareness of the kind of antipathy that might be out there, and indeed was. There had been resistance by primarily the Utah delegation, the Senate and congressional delegation, to the idea of further federal land holding, federal control of public lands. Now, it's important to understand that the Bears Ears National Monument, as designated, that boundary, every inch, every acre of land within that 1.35 million acre area, which is significant, was federal land to begin with. A national monument can't be carved out of private land. It can't be carved out of state land. But once the designation took place, it wasn't too many months down the road when the Trump administration started having some rumblings. A lot of that driven by powerful members of Congress, particularly the senior-most senator, Orrin Hatch, who happens to be from Utah. And so once Ryan Zinke was appointed as Secretary of the Interior, which that position oversees both the Bureau of Indian Affairs as well as the BLM and the National Park Service. So it's an interesting bridge role. He was quickly, in April of 2017, was directed to undertake a review of all national monuments that had been over a certain acreage amount that had been designated in the last 21 years. And that number seems a little arbitrary until you realize that 1996 was the year that Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument was designated by President Clinton, another large landscape scale national monument in southern Utah. So all of which is to say that for the last year, the efforts of the coalition have pivoted from more proactive vision toward healing, toward collaborative management, toward really healing over that relationship between tribes and the federal government, which is a long and storied and complicated history, to once again on the defensive and kind of fending off the federal government in a lot of ways, which shows the power that a change of administration can have. So this unprecedented review process took place. Ryan Zinke visited a number of national monuments, but the directive from the very get-go was to start with Bears Ears. It was the craw in their throat, and in their craw, and so, zooming ahead, on December 4th, 2017, President Trump went to Salt Lake City, and despite protests by thousands of people in the streets, purported to reduce and to some degree undo Bears Ears National Monument, which is fairly unprecedented as well. It's been reduced by more than 85%. Purportedly, and the courts will decide at this point whether that is legal action for a president to take.
And there are multiple lawsuits, I understand.
There are multiple lawsuits, yeah, and it's sort of a triangle, a trifecta of lawsuits with the tribes, once again, always leading. Tribal voices front and center. It has always been the MO. And so the tribes are suing the Trump administration and the appropriate appointed officials. And then Utah Diné Bikéyah, the organization that I've worked with, is also plaintiff in in another lawsuit, and then along with a number of local, more regional organizations, including Archaeology Southwest, Friends of Cedar Mesa, and a number of others. And then the third lawsuit, all of these have been consolidated in federal DC court. The third are a number of conservation organizations, including the Wilderness Society and the Sierra Club, and organizations that have a stake in seeing the lands and resources protected. And so that's in process. The law moves slowly, which has both good and bad aspects to it. The Trump administration has moved to relocate the lawsuit to the District of Utah, which they probably think would behoove them, that they might have a friendlier audience there. But for now, that motion hasn't been granted. So it's going to be a long plod. But scholars and the tribes, but truly the vast majority of legal scholarship, because this is a very public kind of issue, a very newsy legal issue, has analyzed that under the 1906 Antiquities Act, most likely a president doesn't have the authority to undo a national monument. That under the property clause of the Constitution, this was a delegated authority that Congress granted to the presidents, and it expressly lays out the authority for a president to designate, and there is no language indicating that a president may undo. And actually, succeeding laws that have been passed since, such as the Federal Lands Policy and Management Act, which governs BLM lands, which was in 1976 passed, included express language reserving to Congress the authority to modify or undo a national monument designation. So there's a lot of speculation that this suit, because of its prominence, will proceed to the Supreme Court with relative rapidity. We'll move along fairly quickly. It's a question of executive authority, and it's never been fully resolved. There have been here and there attorney general opinions, various things of that nature since the 1930s, again with the majority of that weight landing on the side that no, in fact, a president can protect an area but may not unprotect an area. But time will tell. And in the meantime, tribes are holding very strong to their position and proceeding with management planning, which was what they should be investing energy in now anyway, figuring out what is the best way to manage a cultural landscape. What does it look like for tribes to sit shoulder to shoulder with the federal agencies and to include their particular forms of traditional knowledge into the management and administration of public lands that belong to all Americans.
So we're like very close to the end. Final last question, try to answer briefly. How do you think you're going to practice law after you get your degree? Is that what you think you're going to do?
That'll be interesting, Paul. I think I'd love to practice for a while. I'd love to have that be part of my quiver. I've definitely seen through my work, and it's been so interesting to have law school side by side with the Bears Ears work, that there's a lot of ways of making change, and not all of them involve lawsuits, and not even all of them involve the passage of laws per se. But they all, I think the common thread is really recognizing and being able to articulate a compelling vision, whether that's in a legal argument or in a story, in a song, in a prayer. And so I think, there'll always be the part of me that's a writer and an activist, and I hope that the legal part will continue to help inform and offer insight to that. But I certainly wouldn't want to put on the blinders, and especially at this moment that we exist in, I think it's particularly important to be able to see and read and speak across the lines.
Okay, on that note, I want to thank you so much, Anna, for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Paul.
I've been speaking with Anna Brady, a third-year law student at the U of O. She serves as a policy and communications strategist for Utah Diné Bikéyah. Brady will be a panelist at the Environmental Justice, Race, and Public Land Symposium held at the University of Oregon May 9th through 11th, 2018. Thanks so much for watching.